Episode 2, World War II, 1939. Welcome to Napflix. Tonight we step into a year that changed the direction of the 20th century. Not all at once, but month by month. Find a comfortable place and let us begin. This is 1939. When we left the world at the end of the previous episode, war had not yet begun, but peace was already failing. The year 1939 did not arrive as a sudden rupture. It arrived quietly, almost politely, carrying forward routines, negotiations, and the language of restraint. This is why 1939 is both an ending and a beginning. It marks the end of the long interwar pause, which was the period that was shaped by exhaustion after the First World War and by the belief that catastrophe could be delayed indefinitely. At the same time, it marks the beginning of a new kind of conflict. For the first 8 months of this year, life appears almost normal. Then, in the final 4 months, everything changes. This episode follows 1939 month by month, watching how the world moves from restraint to action. Take a slow breath and let us begin. Part 1, The Long Approach, January-August 1939. January of 1939 opened without drama. Across the world, governments continued their routines. Diplomatic cables were exchanged. Newspapers reported speeches filled with familiar language about peace and restraint. Daily life moved forward in predictable patterns. And yet, trust was almost gone. The international system still existed in structure, but not in authority. Treaties had not disappeared, but belief in them had weakened. Diplomacy continued largely because there was nothing else to replace it, not because anyone truly expected it to work. Meetings were held, but expectations were low. Statements were issued, but carefully phrased to avoid commitment. Behind closed doors, officials increasingly spoke in terms of probability rather than prevention. The language of certainty had vanished, replaced by hedging, delay, and contingency. A key concept shaped this moment: appeasement fatigue. Appeasement fatigue was not a formal policy, but a psychological condition. It described the growing realization that repeated concessions had not produced stability, yet no clear alternative seemed less dangerous. Governments were aware that previous compromises had failed to contain expansion, but they were equally aware that confrontation risked war before societies felt ready for it. As a result, diplomacy continued even as belief in its effectiveness quietly dissolved. But to ordinary people, January felt strangely normal. But beneath this surface calm, anxiety persisted. People sensed instability without being able to name it. News was consumed more attentively. International developments were followed with unease rather than curiosity. Conversations became cautious, especially in public spaces. This emotional contradiction created tension. Life felt stable, but the future did not. And most importantly, by January 1939, rearmament had almost been normalized. Rearmament refers to the process by which states expand and modernize their military forces in preparation for potential conflict. Earlier in the decade, this process had been controversial and politically sensitive. By 1939, it was increasingly accepted as necessary. Military budgets rose quietly. Industrial production shifted gradually toward defense needs. New technologies were tested, refined, and incorporated into planning. What made this significant was not speed, but acceptance. Rearmament no longer felt like an exception. It felt like adaptation. This normalization altered expectations. War preparation no longer implied immediate war. It became a background activity, part of governance rather than a signal of crisis. That subtle shift reduced alarm while increasing danger. Politically, January exposed a deeper problem: eroding legitimacy. Political legitimacy refers to public confidence that institutions can protect stability, security, and order. By early 1939, this confidence was uneven and fragile. Governments struggled to explain how peace would be preserved. They could describe intentions, but not guarantees. Policy appeared reactive rather than decisive, which fed public uncertainty. This erosion did not trigger rebellion or panic. Instead, it produced resignation. People adjusted expectations downward. Overall, you can say psychological denial played a crucial role in January. Denial here does not mean ignorance. It means selective attention. Many people understood that conditions were deteriorating, but avoided fully confronting what that might imply. Denial functioned as emotional self-protection. The memory of the First World War remained vivid. Entire societies had been shaped by loss, displacement, and trauma. To emotionally prepare for another conflict felt unbearable. As a result, hope persisted even when evidence contradicted it. But it shifted from belief in peace to belief in delay. Social routines took on new meaning. Work schedules, family gatherings, entertainment, and seasonal habits offered structure in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. People continued planning weddings, careers, and education, even as uncertainty loomed. In this sense, January was a month of emotional compartmentalization. One concrete event in January hinted at what modern war was becoming. In late January 1939, the city of Barcelona fell during the Spanish Civil War. This conflict, which had lasted since 1936, had already drawn international attention as a testing ground for new military tactics, including aerial bombardment of cities and ideological warfare. The fall of Barcelona signaled that the conflict was nearing its conclusion. More importantly, it reinforced a troubling lesson. Modern war was no longer confined to battlefields. Civilians were targets. Cities were strategic objects. Many observers understood this quietly. Few dared to discuss it openly. February 1939. Diplomacy without belief. February unfolded with movement but without momentum. Diplomatic exchanges continued across capitals, and official calendars remained filled with meetings, discussions, and carefully worded statements. On paper, international engagement appeared active. In practice, few participants expected these efforts to produce lasting solutions. Negotiation had become a process maintained out of necessity rather than confidence. This quiet shift mattered. Earlier in the interwar years, diplomacy had been driven by the belief that compromise could stabilize Europe. By February 1939, that belief had thinned. Officials still spoke the language of peace, but privately prepared for failure. Agreements were discussed without expectation that they would hold, and assurances were offered without conviction that they would be honored. Diplomacy was no longer preventive. It was rather performative. Performative diplomacy refers to negotiation conducted primarily to signal reasonableness and restraint, rather than to resolve underlying conflict. In February, talks reassured domestic audiences and delayed difficult decisions, but they no longer shaped strategic reality. The appearance of engagement mattered more than its outcome. Time itself became policy. This approach is best understood as strategic delay, the deliberate use of postponement as a substitute for action. Many governments believed that time might still soften demands, improve readiness, or produce an unforeseen solution. Acting decisively felt dangerous. Waiting felt safer, yet delay carried its own cost. While public diplomacy moved slowly, military planning accelerated quietly. Planning did not always involve visible mobilization. Instead, it focused on coordination, logistics, training schedules, and the refinement of doctrine. These activities were less dramatic, but more consequential. Military institutions increasingly prepared for speed rather than endurance. The expectation was that any future conflict would be decided quickly before opponents could fully organize. Psychological shock was treated as a strategic weapon, capable of collapsing resistance without prolonged fighting. Trauma played a central role in shaping this moment. The memory of the First World War was not abstract, it was lived experience. Leaders and civilians alike remembered how quickly optimism had turned into devastation. That memory encouraged caution, but also paralysis. Every decision carried the shadow of past loss. Economic behavior mirrored this caution. Investment slowed. Markets reacted nervously to international developments. Governments prioritized stability above all else, reinforcing diplomatic delay as the least disruptive option. By the end of February, nothing had collapsed, but the space for belief had narrowed. Negotiations continued without faith. February did not directly answer the question of whether war would come. Instead, it asked a more important question. How long could postponement last before it became a choice with consequences? March 1939, the illusion shatters. For years, expansion had been explained as temporary, corrective, and limited. Each change to borders was presented as the final adjustment required to restore stability. By March 1939, that explanation no longer held. The idea that expansion would stop collapsed in full view. In mid-March, German forces moved into the remainder of Czechoslovakia, dismantling what was left of a sovereign state. There was no claim of protecting ethnic minorities this time, no referendum, no language of self-determination. Power was exercised directly, without disguise. This mattered because it exposed direct intent. What had previously been framed as revision, the correction of perceived injustices, now appeared as expansion for its own sake. The distinction was crucial. With this act, the logic of restraint failed. Appeasement ceased to function as a credible strategy in March. Appeasement, as a concept, rests on the belief that limited concessions can satisfy demands and reduce the incentive for further conflict. It assumes that grievances have boundaries and that compromise can restore balance. March demonstrated that this assumption no longer applied. Concessions had been made, boundaries had been adjusted, yet expansion continued. This forced a political reckoning. The debate was no longer about whether appeasement was generous enough, but whether it had ever matched reality. For many governments, this was a moment of political shock. Statements of reassurance issued earlier in the year suddenly appeared hollow. Diplomatic language lost its authority. Policy frameworks built on patience and accommodation were exposed as misaligned with events. Appeasement failed publicly. The collapse of illusion in March was preceded by a warning in February. Recognition of the new Spanish government in February was not an act of endorsement. It was an admission of reality. Force had prevailed. The international response adjusted accordingly. This set a precedent. It reinforced the idea that fates accompli, actions completed before opposition could respond, would be accepted after the fact. A fait accompli is a strategic move designed to present others with a completed reality, forcing them to choose between acceptance and escalation. March followed this logic. Strategically, March exposed an imbalance that had existed quietly for years. The absorption of Czechoslovakia altered the map decisively. Industrial resources, defensive terrain, and strategic depth shifted in a single movement. Potential resistance disappeared without a battle. It also demonstrated how quickly the balance of power could change without formal war. Peace depended on restraint by those with power and acceptance by those without it. It existed only as long as expansion paused. Once movement resumed, peace dissolved without formal declaration. This realization reshaped thinking. From this point forward, delay would not be mistaken for stability. It would be recognized for what it was: time borrowed against consequence. April 1939. Lines are drawn. The collapse of belief that expansion would stop forced governments to move from interpretation to decision. What had once been debated in theory now demanded position. April did not bring war, but it did bring lines drawn carefully, publicly, and with consequences that could no longer be ignored. Negotiation, which aims to resolve conflict through agreement, began to give way to deterrence, the attempt to prevent action by promising consequence. Deterrence does not require trust. Diplomacy assumes shared interest in stability. Deterrence assumes the opposite, that stability must be enforced by risk. April marked the moment when many governments accepted that persuasion alone had failed. In early April, security guarantees were formalized and clarified, most notably those extending protection to states whose independence was now openly threatened. These guarantees were not expressions of confidence. They were expressions of limit. A guarantee in this context is a formal pledge to respond militarily if another state's sovereignty is violated. It transforms political concern into obligation. This change exposed a deep tension between moral obligation and strategic readiness. Morally, allowing further expansion without response threatened the idea that international order had meaning at all. Strategically, responding too early risked conflict under unfavorable conditions. Another event reinforced this realization. In April 1939, Italy invaded and occupied Albania. The operation was swift, decisive, and met with minimal resistance. Albania was absorbed almost immediately. This invasion mattered not because of Albania's size, but because of its message. It demonstrated how quickly a sovereign state could disappear when power was applied and response delayed. It also confirmed that expansion was not confined to a single actor. The international system was under pressure from multiple directions at once. Albania's fall reinforced a growing belief. The cost of inaction was becoming visible. April also made economic pressure harder to hide. Accelerating military spending strained national budgets. Resources were redirected from civilian priorities to defense. Governments faced difficult choices between social stability and strategic necessity. This reallocation carried consequences. Military spending can stimulate employment, but it also distorts economies. Civilian goods become scarcer. Inflationary pressure grows. Long-term sustainability weakens. April marked the moment when economic sacrifice became visible rather than theoretical. Public anxiety, long contained, began to surface. Culturally, April marked a noticeable change. Escapism did not vanish, but it lost dominance. Entertainment became more subdued. Narratives turned serious, reflective, and restrained. Themes of duty, endurance, and consequence appeared more frequently. Art and media no longer avoided reality, they adjusted to it. From this point forward, events would test whether those lines meant deterrence or merely delay. May 1939, War Becomes Thinkable. By May, war was no longer a distant abstraction. It had entered the realm of planning, language, and expectation. What had once been discussed cautiously behind closed doors now appeared more openly in public discourse. Governments still avoided announcing inevitability, but the question was no longer whether conflict was possible, it was how it would unfold. War planning was no longer hypothetical. Military institutions across the world refined schedules, logistics, and coordination with an assumption that these plans would be used. Exercises were no longer framed as precaution alone, they were rehearsals. The language of contingency quietly shifted toward the language of readiness. This did not mean war was desired, it meant it was being prepared for seriously. A new concept dominated May: strategic inevitability. Strategic inevitability describes the belief that, given existing conditions, conflict is no longer preventable through policy alone. It does not mean war must happen immediately, but that all available alternatives lead toward it. By May 1939, many planners accepted this framework. Diplomacy might delay conflict, deterrence might shape its timing, but avoidance no longer appeared realistic. Another shift in May was linguistic. Words associated with mobilization began to appear in newspapers, speeches, and everyday conversation. Mobilization refers not only to the movement of troops, but to the reorientation of society toward conflict, industry, labor, logistics, and psychology. Importantly, mobilization was discussed without alarm. It was framed as responsible governance, not emergency. This normalization mattered. It signaled that war was being integrated into expectation rather than resisted emotionally. The public was being prepared. On May 22, 1939, Germany and Italy signed what became known as the Pact of Steel. This agreement formally bound the two states to support each other militarily and politically in the event of war. Unlike earlier diplomatic arrangements, this pact was explicit in its intent and scope. The Pact of Steel mattered for two reasons. First, it confirmed alignment rather than convenience. It was not a temporary understanding, but a commitment to shared action. Second, it reinforced the sense that blocs were solidifying. Neutrality was becoming harder to maintain. The pact sent a clear signal. Preparations were no longer defensive alone. May also force neutral states to reconsider assumptions. Neutrality had once been seen as insulation from conflict. By mid-1939, that belief weakened. The pace and scope of expansion suggested that geography and size offered limited protection. Neutral governments reviewed defenses, revised contingency plans, and reconsidered diplomatic posture. Neutrality was no longer assumed to be passive. It also required preparation. This realization contributed to the sense that no one stood fully outside the coming conflict. This shift was especially visible among the young. Youth faced a future that suddenly appeared interrupted. Education, careers, and personal plans felt provisional. This created a different stress. June 1939, the weight of waiting. June was a month where nothing happened loudly and everything happened inwardly. In earlier years, silence had been reassuring. It meant crises were avoided, compromises reached, or at least postponed. By June 1939, silence carried a different meaning. It suggested accumulation. Each quiet day added weight to what had not yet occurred. The absence of action did not relieve anxiety. It intensified it. People waited not for reassurance, but for interruption. Waiting itself became exhausting. This exhaustion was psychological rather than physical. It came from sustained alertness without release, from living with unresolved threat that offered no clear response. Diplomacy in June resembled habit more than hope. Officials continued to speak carefully, avoiding language that might provoke escalation. But trust, the belief that dialogue could still alter outcomes, had largely disappeared. Negotiation functioned as delay, not solution. This produced a peculiar contradiction. One of the clearest signs of this transition appeared quietly in civilian life. Civil defense preparations spread gradually. Blackout discussions, emergency planning, and public safety guidance entered everyday conversation, often framed as precaution rather than expectation. Civil defense refers to non-military preparations designed to protect civilian populations during conflict, including shelters, evacuation plans, and infrastructure adaptation. In June, these preparations expanded without fanfare. A significant event in June illustrated how global tension was no longer confined to Europe. In June 1939, a diplomatic crisis unfolded in Tientsin, where Japanese forces blockaded a foreign concession, isolating it and applying pressure without declaring war. This event, often referred to as the Tientsin Incident, demonstrated a modern strategy of coercion, applying force incrementally while avoiding formal conflict. The incident mattered because it showed how power could be exercised below the threshold of declared war. It reinforced a growing lesson of the decade. Conflict no longer required announcement. Pressure, isolation, and intimidation could achieve objectives while maintaining the appearance of peace. June absorbed this lesson quietly. July 1939, preparation without announcement. By July, the world no longer needed explanation. The patterns established in the previous months continued almost automatically. Military readiness in July approached a practical threshold. Plans were being finalized. Logistics were tested. Timetables refined. Coordination between forces improved. This did not produce visible mobilization because visibility itself carried risk at that time. Preparation was deliberately quiet. The goal was to be ready without signaling urgency too early. This strategy reflected strategic patience, the belief that timing mattered as much as action. Acting too soon could unite opposition. Waiting until readiness was complete maximized advantage. The most consequential event of July occurred far from Europe. On July 26, 1939, the United States formally announced the termination of the 1911 U.S. Japan Treaty of Commerce and Navigation. This treaty had governed trade relations, commercial rights, and economic cooperation between the two countries for nearly 3 decades. The termination did not immediately halt trade. Instead, it removed the legal framework that protected it. After 6 months, the United States would be free to impose tariffs, embargoes, or restrictions without violating treaty obligations. This was a decisive shift. It marked the emergence of economic warfare as a primary strategic tool. Economic warfare refers to the use of trade, resources, and financial pressure to weaken an opponent without direct military confrontation. It operates below the threshold of war, but can have consequences just as severe. By withdrawing from the treaty, the United States signaled that economic relations were no longer neutral. Access to resources, especially oil, steel, and industrial materials, would now be conditional. This decision mattered globally. It demonstrated that conflict was no longer defined solely by armies and borders. It extended into supply chains, shipping routes, and industrial capacity. Power could be applied incrementally without a declaration and still reshape strategic reality. July revealed that the coming war would not be confined to battlefields. The U.S.-Japan decision fit into a broader pattern visible across 1939. States increasingly applied pressure without crossing the formal line into war. Blockades, trade restrictions, diplomatic isolation, and coercive signaling became standard tools. This approach reflected a new understanding of conflict. Public political language remained cautious. Leaders avoided alarmist rhetoric. Statements emphasized stability and responsibility. This was considered a form of management. Panic would destabilize economies and societies. People sensed that the window for normal life was narrowing, even if they could not yet say why. After July, events would no longer feel suspended. They would feel imminent. Preparation without announcement had reached its limit. August 1939, the last calm. August did not feel calm while it was happening. On August 23, 1939, the world was stunned by an announcement that redefined the final days of peace. Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, formerly known as the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. On the surface, the agreement promised neutrality between two ideological enemies. It declared that neither side would attack the other, and that disputes would be resolved peacefully. That alone was shocking. But the true significance lay beneath the surface. Attached to the pact were secret protocols, undisclosed at the time, which divided large parts of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. These protocols outlined how territory would be partitioned long before any military action had occurred. Borders were redrawn on paper before being altered on the ground. It was pre-war coordination. The pact removed the final strategic uncertainty. It eliminated the risk of a two-front conflict and created conditions in which action could proceed without immediate consequence. The future had been scheduled. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact mattered for several reasons. First, it demonstrated that ideology could be subordinated to strategy. Long-standing hostility was set aside in favor of calculation. Second, it exposed the limits of diplomatic assumption. Many had believed that certain alignments were impossible. August proved otherwise. Third, it isolated potential resistance. Strategic realignment reshaped the map before war began. Most importantly, it confirmed that peace no longer depended on restraint, but on timing. The announcement sent shockwaves across the world. Allies reassessed assumptions overnight. Neutral states reconsidered safety. Observers realized that the final barrier to war had fallen. The final week of August was all about unbearable stillness. Mobilization occurred quietly. Evacuation plans were reviewed. Emergency measures were prepared without announcement. People listened more closely to radio broadcasts. Time had run out. Part 2, September 1939. War arrives. September 1939, the break. War did not arrive in September with any kind of ceremony. For years, crisis had unfolded through speeches, negotiations, and delays. Conflict had been discussed as possibility, as leverage, as threat. In September, it became reality, not through declaration, but through movement. Speed mattered immediately. Military action unfolded faster than public understanding. Decisions made quietly over months were executed in days. Plans that had existed on paper became reality before diplomacy could respond. The tempo of events outpaced debate, leaving governments and civilians reacting rather than choosing. The most important change in September was the collapse of delay as a strategy. Throughout the previous months, delay had functioned as policy. Time had been used to manage fear, prepare resources, and avoid irreversible choice. September revealed the limits of that approach. This war felt different immediately because it did not announce itself first. In earlier conflicts, declarations often preceded movement. In September 1939, movement preceded meaning. By the time the world fully understood what was happening, events were already irreversible. This mattered psychologically. It denied people the time to prepare emotionally. Shock was not produced by fear of what might happen, but by the realization that it already had. By the end of September's first days, the world had crossed a threshold. The interwar period was over. From this point forward, events would no longer be shaped primarily by diplomacy or patience, but by movement, reaction, and consequence. This is where the structure of the story changes. What follows is not a single narrative, but many, unfolding at the same time, in different places under the same pressure. September was the break. Everything after it moved differently. September 1939, Germany. In September 1939, Germany entered the war with a clearly defined plan and a high degree of institutional readiness. What occurred during this month was not an improvisation driven by emotion, but the execution of long-standing strategic, military, and economic calculations. Germany's central objective in September was to achieve a rapid military decision before other powers could fully mobilize or coordinate an effective response. This objective shaped the timing, scale, and method of the invasion that began the war. German leadership believed that any prolonged conflict would favor its opponents, particularly in terms of industrial capacity, access to raw materials, and global resources. As a result, the strategy for September 1939 emphasized speed and decisiveness. The immediate goal was the defeat of Poland as quickly as possible, thereby reshaping the strategic map of Eastern Europe before Britain and France could translate declarations of war into military action. The broader aim was to establish a position of strength from which Germany could dictate the next phase of the conflict. This approach assumed that political responses would lag behind military events. On the evening of August 31st, 1939, just hours before the invasion of Poland, a small group of German operatives carried out a false flag attack on a German radio station in the town of Gleiwitz, today Gliwice, Poland. A false flag operation is an action designed to appear as though it was carried out by someone else in order to justify a response. In this case, the attack was made to look like a Polish assault on German territory. What really happened was something totally different. German security personnel, operating under orders, dressed in Polish military uniforms, and seized the radio station briefly. They broadcast a short message in Polish calling for resistance against Germany. The broadcast was deliberately crude and brief, just long enough to be reported. To make the incident appear genuine, the operatives left behind the body of a man who had been murdered earlier. He was a German civilian who had been arrested, drugged, killed, and dressed in Polish uniform. Within internal Nazi documentation, these victims were referred to as Konserve, literally canned goods, a term used to describe bodies planted at staged scenes to support fabricated incidents. The Gleiwitz incident was not meant to convince the international community in the long term. It was meant to serve three immediate purposes: domestic justification. It provided a narrative for the German public that Germany was responding to Polish aggression, not initiating war. Diplomatic framing. It allowed German leadership to claim, at least formally, that military action was defensive, aligning with prior statements that Germany would not act aggressively. Psychological preparation. It framed the invasion as necessary and reactive, reducing internal resistance to war. The incident was reported in German media as evidence of Polish hostility, alongside claims of other alleged border provocations. The Gleiwitz incident was part of a broader set of staged provocations collectively referred to as Operation Himmler. Operation Himmler involved multiple fabricated border incidents along the German-Polish frontier, all designed to create the appearance of sustained Polish aggression. These incidents were planned and coordinated by German security agencies in the final days before the invasion. The goal was not legal legitimacy, but narrative control. On September 1st, 1939, German leadership cited these incidents in public statements announcing military action against Poland. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. The operation began in the early hours of the morning, following a series of staged incidents used to justify the action publicly. These incidents were designed to present the invasion as a defensive response rather than an act of aggression. The invasion marked the first large-scale military operation of the Second World War. The invasion was presented as a response to repeated attacks, even though the operations had been staged internally. Within days, the narrative collapsed internationally, but by then the invasion was already underway and irreversible. The Gleiwitz incident is significant because it demonstrates how modern wars can be initiated through manufactured justification, how information control and deception were integrated into military strategy, how the sequence of action before explanation shaped the opening of World War II. It illustrates that the war did not begin because diplomacy failed in the moment, but because the decision for war had already been made and justification was constructed afterward. This incident is now one of the clearest documented examples of a false flag operation used to initiate a major international conflict. The campaign demonstrated a form of warfare commonly referred to as blitzkrieg or lightning war. While not a formal doctrine codified in official manuals, blitzkrieg describes a method of combat based on rapid concentration of force, close coordination between air and ground units, deep penetration into enemy territory, disruption of command, communication, and logistics. German forces used aircraft to target transportation networks, communication lines, and supply routes. Armored units advanced quickly, bypassing heavily defended positions rather than engaging them directly. Infantry units followed to secure territory and suppress remaining resistance. The intent was to prevent the opposing military from organizing coherent defense rather than to destroy it outright. German military operations in September relied on centralized planning combined with decentralized execution. Overall objectives were set at higher command levels, while field commanders were given discretion to act based on rapidly changing conditions. This command structure allowed for faster decision making on the battlefield and reduced delays caused by rigid hierarchies. Communication between units was prioritized to maintain operational tempo. The effectiveness of this system depended on training, discipline, and prior preparation. German leadership entered September with strong confidence in its military system and planning assumptions. Previous successes in territorial expansion without significant resistance reinforced the belief that rapid action would prevent effective opposition. This confidence influenced operational decisions, encouraging aggressive timelines and limited contingency planning for prolonged resistance. Early advances during the campaign appeared to confirm these expectations. However, this confidence was based on short term outcomes rather than long term sustainability. Germany's war planning in September was shaped by economic constraints. Rearmament had placed heavy demands on the national economy, diverting resources from civilian production and creating dependency on continued expansion to secure raw materials and labor. A prolonged war without territorial or resource gains would have increased economic strain. As a result, rapid military success was seen as economically advantageous. Short campaigns reduced immediate consumption of resources and delayed the impact of shortages. September's strategy was therefore closely tied to economic planning. The military worked alongside transportation authorities, industrial planners, and administrative bodies to support troop movement, supply distribution, and territorial control. This reflected years of integration between civilian and military systems. War planning was not isolated within the armed forces. It involved the broader state apparatus. By the end of September 1939, Germany had achieved most of its immediate military objectives. The campaign appeared to validate its strategic assumptions about speed, coordination, and the effectiveness of rapid action. At the same time, the events of September committed Germany to a broader war that could not be resolved through a single campaign. September 1939, from Germany's perspective, was a demonstration of planning put into action and the point at which calculation became irreversible commitment. September 1939, Poland. For Poland, September 1939 was an existential moment. The state that had been rebuilt only 2 decades earlier now faced the reality of invasion with limited options, constrained geography, and uncertain external support. What unfolded during this month was shaped less by choice than by circumstance. Poland entered September knowing that war, if it came, would be fought defensively. Its military planning assumed the need to protect long borders on multiple fronts, a task made difficult by geography. The country lacked natural defensive barriers and was surrounded by larger, more heavily industrialized powers. This strategic exposure forced Polish planners to spread forces thinly rather than concentrate them. Poland's defense doctrine emphasized territorial integrity rather than rapid counterattack. The objective was not immediate victory, but resistance long enough for allies to intervene. This assumption proved decisive. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland from multiple directions. The attack combined airstrikes, armored advances, and coordinated infantry movement. Transportation networks, communication lines, and military installations were targeted early to disrupt coordination. The speed of the assault challenged Polish command structures. Units often found themselves isolated, fighting without clear information about developments elsewhere. It was a national emergency from the first day. One of Poland's central challenges in September was strategic isolation. Strategic isolation refers to a situation in which a state faces military threat without the immediate ability of allies to provide effective assistance. Although Poland had security guarantees, these did not translate into rapid military relief. Geography played a critical role. Poland's allies were separated by distance and intervening territory. Any meaningful support required time Poland did not have. This gap between promise and presence defined the month. For civilians, The war began abruptly. Air raids targeted cities and transportation hubs, bringing conflict directly into daily life. Civil defense systems were limited, and many people were encountering modern warfare for the first time. Civilians fled combat zones, often with little information and few resources. Roads became congested with refugees, complicating military movement and deepening chaos. The distinction between front line and home front blurred almost instantly. Poland's government attempted to maintain coordination under extreme pressure. Administrative institutions worked to manage evacuation, communication, and military supply, even as infrastructure was disrupted. The priority was continuity, ensuring that the state remained functional as long as possible. Leadership decisions were shaped by the belief that survival depended on endurance. A decisive turning point came on September 17, 1939, when Soviet forces entered eastern Poland. This action fundamentally altered Poland's situation. The opening of a second front eliminated remaining strategic options. Defensive planning had not anticipated resistance against simultaneous pressure from both east and west. Strategic isolation became complete. By mid-September, Poland's objective shifted. Victory was no longer plausible. Survival of the population, the military, and the idea of the state became the focus. Forces withdrew where possible, seeking to preserve manpower and leadership. This transition mattered. A state does not cease to exist solely through occupation. Survival can take institutional, cultural, and political forms beyond territory. Poland's leadership acted with this understanding. Even as conventional defense collapsed, structures of resistance began to form. Military units regrouped where possible. Civilian networks adapted to occupation. Administrative continuity, though fragmented, remained a priority. These early efforts laid the groundwork for future resistance. By the end of September 1939, Poland had been overrun militarily. But the story did not end with defeat. The state had been attacked, divided, and occupied, yet its institutions, identity, and resolve persisted. What had been lost was territory. What remained was continuity. September, from Poland's perspective, was the moment when national survival became something larger than immediate military outcome. The consequences of that shift would shape the war that followed. September 1939, Britain. Britain entered the war not because it believed itself ready, but because the alternatives had collapsed. What unfolded during this month was shaped by obligation, restraint, and an acute awareness of unpreparedness. On the morning of September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. This declaration did not come suddenly. It followed an ultimatum delivered the previous day, demanding the withdrawal of German forces from Poland. When no response was received, the ultimatum expired. At 11 a.m., the declaration became official. This moment was announced to the public by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, speaking on radio. His address was calm, measured, and somber. The tone reflected gravity rather than resolve. This mattered. The declaration was not framed as a step toward victory, but as an unavoidable responsibility. The public response in Britain was notably restrained. There were no large celebrations, no scenes of enthusiasm. Instead, the dominant reaction was quiet acceptance. Many people had anticipated this outcome for months. When it arrived, it felt less like a shock and more like confirmation. This mood was shaped by memory. The First World War remained within living memory. Loss was personal, not abstract. Families remembered names carved into memorials, not victories recorded in books. This memory discouraged romanticism. War was understood as suffering first, outcome second. The decision to go to war was driven less by confidence than by moral obligation. Moral obligation in this context refers to the belief that failing to act would undermine credibility, international order, and Britain's own commitments. Guarantees made earlier in the year carried weight. Ignoring them would signal that treaties no longer mattered. By September, fear of war had been overtaken by fear of inaction. This shift was crucial. Britain did not enter the war believing it could quickly win. It entered because not entering would mean accepting a world where force alone determined outcomes. Despite the declaration, Britain was not fully prepared for war. Rearmament had begun late and unevenly. The army was relatively small and lacked modern equipment in sufficient quantities. Air defenses were improving, but incomplete. Coordination with allies was still developing. Britain's strategy at the outset was defensive. The immediate goal was not decisive action, but stabilization, protecting the homeland, securing supply routes, and buying time to mobilize resources fully. This lack of readiness reinforced caution. Following the declaration, large-scale military action did not immediately follow in Western Europe. This period became known as the Phony War, a term used to describe the months in which Britain and France were formally at war, yet engaged in limited direct combat. The absence of immediate fighting created confusion. War had begun legally, but not experientially. For civilians, daily life continued with adjustments rather than upheaval. This reinforced the sense that the conflict would be long rather than sudden. Civil defense measures expanded rapidly in September. Blackouts were enforced to reduce vulnerability to air attack. Air raid precautions, known as ARC, became part of daily routine. Gas masks were distributed widely, even though many doubted they would be used. These measures reflected lessons learned from the previous war and from recent conflicts elsewhere. The expectation was that civilians would be directly affected, even if not immediately. Preparation replaced denial. The war was framed as a collective burden rather than a mobilizing spectacle. September 1939, France. For France, September 1939 was shaped less by action than by memory. The country entered the war carrying the physical and psychological legacy of the previous one. France's primary concern in September was security, not expansion or initiative. Security anxiety refers to a persistent fear that national survival depends on preventing sudden invasion. In France, this anxiety was rooted in lived history. The German invasion of 1914 and the devastation that followed were not distant lessons. They were national trauma. As a result, French strategic thinking prioritized protection of territory and population above all else. On September 3, 1939, the same day as Britain, France formally declared war on Germany following the expiration of its ultimatum demanding withdrawal from Poland. The declaration was made without enthusiasm and without illusion. French leadership understood that war was unavoidable, but they did not believe it would be swift or clean. Key political figures, including Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, framed the decision as necessary rather than desirable. France's defensive orientation was embodied in the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was a system of fortified defenses built along France's eastern border. It was designed to prevent sudden invasion and to force any attacking army into slower, more predictable movements. The logic behind it was clear: delay the enemy, reduce casualties, and gain time for mobilization. By September 1939, the Maginot Line was seen as a symbol of preparedness, but also of strategic limitation. It reflected a belief that war could be controlled through defense rather than initiative. France trusted fortification more than speed. French military planning assumed that a long war was inevitable and that early aggression carried unnecessary risk. The priority was to preserve forces, protect territory, and wait for conditions to become favorable. This approach led to limited action along the border, including minor advances that stopped quickly. The absence of major engagement reinforced the sense of a war that had begun without motion. The period following the declaration became part of what was later called the Phony War. From France's perspective, this period was characterized by readiness without engagement. Troops were mobilized, defenses reinforced, and logistics organized. Yet daily life for civilians remained relatively stable, though increasingly regulated. This gap between legal war and lived experience created uncertainty. War existed in status, but not yet in sensation. More than any single policy, memory shaped France's behavior in September. The First World War had taught France that victory came at immense cost. That lesson discouraged risk and encouraged caution. It shaped political hesitation, defensive doctrine, and public expectation. September 1939, the Soviet Union. For the Soviet Union, September 1939 was not framed as the beginning of a war. It was framed as an opportunity to reposition power. While much of the world reacted to sudden conflict, Soviet leadership approached the month through calculation, timing, and territorial logic. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union viewed its security environment as unstable and dangerous. It distrusted Western powers, doubted their willingness to confront aggression decisively, and feared encirclement. The priority was not to stop war elsewhere, but to ensure that when war expanded, it would do so on terms favorable to Soviet interests. This thinking shaped every decision. The Soviet leadership sought to avoid immediate direct conflict while ensuring that future threats would be geographically distant and politically manageable. The foundation for Soviet action in September had been laid in August 1939 with the signing of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, commonly known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On September 17, 1939, Soviet forces entered eastern Poland. This action was officially justified as a protective measure. Soviet statements claimed that the Polish state had collapsed and that intervention was necessary to protect populations in the eastern territories. This framing masked the real objective. The Soviet Union moved when it judged that Polish resistance had been decisively weakened and that Western powers would not intervene militarily in the east. Timing was chosen to minimize risk. This was not a spontaneous decision. It was a full-blown execution. Territorial positioning lay at the heart of Soviet strategy. The Soviet leadership believed that buffer zones, regions separating the core of the state from potential adversaries, were essential for survival. Eastern Poland, along with other territories identified in the secret protocols, served this purpose. By advancing westward, the Soviet Union increased the distance between its industrial and political centers and potential invasion routes. This expansion was not framed internally as conquest. It was framed as defensive depth. One of the most striking aspects of Soviet behavior in September was the temporary subordination of ideology. The Soviet state defined itself through opposition to fascism. Yet in September 1939, ideological hostility was set aside in favor of strategic advantage. Cooperation was tactical, not philosophical. Soviet forces moved methodically rather than rapidly. The objective was control, not shock. Military units advanced to occupy designated territories, secure infrastructure, and establish administrative authority. Resistance was limited, not because of overwhelming force, but because conditions had already been altered by earlier events. The operation was planned to avoid escalation. Western powers protested diplomatically, but took no military action against the Soviet Union. This response confirmed Soviet assumptions. Intervention was unlikely. The risk of immediate confrontation was low. This validation mattered. It reinforced the belief that timing and coordination could reshape borders without triggering total war. For the Soviet Union, September 1939 was not experienced as the beginning of World War II in the same way it was elsewhere. It was a moment of positioning. But in September, the Soviet perspective was defined by one principle above all others: act when conditions are favorable. Wait when they are not. September 1939, the world watches. When war began in Europe, much of the world did not move. Across continents, governments observed events with shock, calculation, and restraint. The outbreak of conflict did not immediately trigger global alignment or unified response. Instead, September was defined by watching. For neutral states, September shattered assumptions. Neutrality had long been understood as distance from conflict. Geography, diplomacy, and restraint were believed to offer protection. The speed and coordination of events in early September challenged that belief. Neutral governments reassessed what neutrality actually meant. The lesson was clear. Being uninvolved did not guarantee being unaffected. Many neutral nations prioritized economic stability. Trade relationships were scrutinized for risk. Shipping routes were adjusted. Financial institutions reacted cautiously to volatility. Governments avoided commitments that might entangle them prematurely. This caution reflected uncertainty rather than indifference. No one knew how far or how fast the conflict would spread. The reaction of the United States was closely watched. In September 1939, the United States remained officially neutral. Its legal framework emphasized non-involvement, shaped by public opinion and memory of the First World War. Many Americans opposed entering another European conflict, especially one that appeared sudden and complex. However, neutrality did not mean isolation. Political leaders monitored developments closely. Strategic assessments intensified. Economic and industrial implications were studied. The United States understood that its distance offered time, not immunity. Public reaction was restrained. There was concern, debate, and uncertainty, but no immediate call to arms. War was recognized as serious, but still perceived as distant. The shock of September was global, but uneven. News traveled quickly, radio broadcasts carried updates across borders. Images and reports made clear that the world had entered a new phase. Yet immediate action did not follow everywhere. This gap mattered. It revealed that while the world was interconnected, response was still shaped by national priorities, domestic politics, and strategic calculation. Many governments chose to wait, act too soon, and risk escalation, act too late, and lose influence. Most chose neither. For now, September ended with a world alert, unsettled, and waiting, aware that neutrality, distance, and restraint were no longer guaranteed, only temporary positions in a conflict that had already begun to expand. Part 3, October to December 1939, The Strange Quiet. October arrived with the war officially underway, yet strangely absent. Declarations had been made, borders had been crossed, states were now formally at war, and still, for much of Europe, nothing seemed to move. After the shock of September, the world entered a phase that felt contradictory: war without motion. Like we discussed earlier, phony war refers to the months in which major powers were technically at war, but engaged in little direct fighting, particularly on the Western Front. It was not a false war in legal terms, but it felt unreal in experience. October embodied that unreality. Troops manned borders, equipment was transported, command structures operated continuously, yet large-scale combat did not occur in the way many had expected. After the rapid collapse of September, the pace slowed dramatically. This sudden stillness was disorienting. War had arrived violently and then appeared to pause. For civilians and soldiers alike, the absence of action created uncertainty. People struggled to understand whether this was restraint, preparation, or miscalculation. October was psychologically taxing. The fear of war had been replaced by the strain of waiting inside it. Unlike the months before September, delay was no longer theoretical. People anticipated sudden change without knowing when or how it would come. Anxiety settled into daily life, not as panic, but as constant alertness. The mind had no release. For civilians, October marked the beginning of adaptation. Life adjusted to wartime conditions, even in the absence of direct fighting. Blackouts became routine. Air raid precautions were followed seriously. Rationing systems were introduced or prepared. Travel and communication were regulated. These measures were not responses to immediate destruction. They were responses to expectation. People learned how to live with disruption as a permanent possibility rather than a future threat. One of the most important shifts in October was normalization. War ceased to feel like an event and began to feel like a condition. The novelty of declarations faded. Headlines lost urgency. Emergency measures became routine. This normalization was unsettling. It suggested that war might last far longer than anticipated, not as constant violence, but as a sustained alteration of life. Soldiers experienced October differently. Many units remained inactive, holding positions without engagement. Training continued. Readiness was maintained. But the absence of combat produced its own strain. Waiting in uniform under threat but without action eroded morale in subtle ways. Anticipation replaced fear. Boredom mixed with anxiety. War, for many, felt abstract even as it surrounded them. November 1939, War Becomes Normal. By November, the shock of September had faded. This was the month when war stopped feeling temporary. One of the clearest signs of normalization was the expansion of rationing. Rationing is the controlled distribution of essential goods to ensure fairness, stability, and long-term supply during crisis. In November 1939, rationing systems were introduced or prepared across several countries, even where direct fighting had not yet occurred. Food, fuel, and raw materials were prioritized for military and industrial use. Civilians were asked to adapt early, not because shortages were immediate everywhere, but because governments anticipated prolonged strain. Rationing turned war into a domestic reality. Meals changed, shopping habits shifted. Waste became socially unacceptable. Scarcity was no longer feared, it was managed. November marked a deeper militarization of everyday life. Militarization does not mean soldiers everywhere. It means civilian life reorganized around military necessity. Work schedules adjusted to production needs. Transportation prioritized logistics. Public spaces followed blackout rules and security regulations. Uniforms became common sights, even without combat. Language changed. Time was measured in alerts, drills, and schedules rather than seasons. War entered the routine. On November 30th, 1939, a new conflict began that reshaped perceptions of the war's scope. Soviet forces invaded Finland, initiating what became known as the Winter War. The invasion followed failed negotiations over territory and security concerns. The Soviet Union sought to push its borders westward to create strategic depth. Finland resisted. The Winter War mattered for several reasons. It demonstrated that the conflict was expanding beyond its original frontiers. It showed that smaller nations could resist larger powers under certain conditions. It exposed weaknesses and assumptions about military strength and preparedness. The war unfolded under extreme winter conditions, highlighting the role of environment, morale, and national cohesion in modern warfare. For the global audience, November ended any remaining belief that the war would remain geographically contained. News of the Winter War altered public perception. The conflict was no longer seen as a single chain of events linked to one invasion. It was now a system of pressures unfolding across regions. Neutrality felt increasingly fragile. Distance felt unreliable. The war was spreading sideways, not just forward. Governments refined administrative systems. Registrations, identity controls, labor allocation, and information management expanded. Institutions emphasized order and predictability, knowing that uncertainty eroded morale faster than hardship. The goal was continuity under strain. December 1939. A year closes. A world ends. December did not bring resolution. By the final weeks of 1939, the world understood that the war, which had begun in shock, would not end quickly. The illusion that conflict might be contained, brief, or negotiable had fully disappeared. What remained was acceptance, quiet, heavy, and irreversible. This war would be long. Earlier months had been defined by anticipation, waiting for escalation, hoping for limits, searching for signs that restraint might return. December replaced anticipation with acceptance. The language of emergency softened into the language of duration. The future was no longer imagined as a return. It was imagined as a transformation. By December, illusions had collapsed completely. The belief that treaties alone could restrain power had vanished. The idea that modern war would resemble older conflicts with clear fronts and limited civilian involvement was no longer credible. Even the hope that the war might remain geographically contained had weakened. What replaced illusion was realism. War was understood as systemic, affecting economies, societies, and daily life far beyond battlefields. This clarity was sobering. One event in December reinforced this global understanding. On December 13, 1939, a naval engagement occurred in the South Atlantic known as the Battle of the River Plate. A German warship encountered British naval forces far from Europe, near the coast of South America. This engagement mattered not for its scale, but for its implication. It demonstrated that the war was already global in reach. Naval conflict extended into distant waters. Trade routes and neutral regions were no longer insulated from military action. War had escaped its original geography. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. For civilians, December marked emotional closure. The year ended without the comfort of resolution. Holidays were observed with restraint. Absence, uncertainty, and separation shaped personal life. The idea of after the war began to feel abstract. Psychologically, people stopped asking when the war would end. They began asking how life would continue within it. This internal shift was profound. It marked the moment when war stopped interrupting life and started redefining it. As the year ended, the world stood changed, not because every battle had been fought, but because expectations had been rewritten. The interwar mindset, fragile, hesitant, and illusion-bound, was gone. In its place stood a world bracing for prolonged transformation. December 1939 did not end the war's beginning. It ended the idea that the war was temporary. What followed would not simply be a continuation of conflict, but a reshaping of history itself, measured not in months, but in endurance, loss, and irreversible change. Standing at the edge of 1940, there is a quiet understanding shared across societies. This conflict will not move slowly. The pauses, hesitations, and strange stillness of the opening months will not last. The systems that have been assembled, the doctrines refined, and the expectations adjusted are about to be tested at speed. 1940 will not ask for patience. It will demand a reaction. As we step into the next year, remember that history is not only shaped by moments of action, but by the quiet decisions that make those moments possible. Take a slow breath. The world is about to accelerate, and we will move through it together, one year at a time. For now, rest well and see you soon.